files. We're going to look at some of the small, less used tools in Photoshop and Photoshop Elements. And before we start, I'd like you to come over to the toolbar, and I want you to notice there are two areas that have special tools. One of them is going to include the Blur tool and a Sharpen tool and a Smudge tool. And which one appears in the tool panel depends upon which one you used last, or which one is the default. So if you find what looks like a little eyedrop or teardrop, that means the Blur tool was the one that was in front. And if you go to your option bar, or in Elements or in full Photoshop, you can actually pop that open and see the names. We go to this option bar, and there are three tools there: Blur, Sharpen, and Smudge. Yeah, give it the finger. I said, I'm glad it was the pointer finger. I would hate to have an X-rated video. All right. Each of these is destructive, meaning it's going to destroy pixels. So it must not work directly on the original layer of your image. That's generally our rule anyway. And each of these does different things, and the limit of their usefulness has to do with how small is the area you want to change. If you want to blur an entire background of an image, I would not use the Blur tool. I would select and apply a filter to it. But in this case, we're going to look at some very interesting ways of using these tools. I gave you, on your flash drive, I gave you a PDF file that was downloadable, and it came from Snickerdoodle. How about that for a website? And it's called How to Use the Smudge Tool in Photoshop and Photoshop Elements. Kind of nicely written. And it will review this in paper, and you can print it out. So, let's go. File. Open. You need to go back to your Saturday folder, and you're going to find your special tool images. Open that folder. And let's see. I've tried to indicate which tools are going to be for. Let's do the Blur tool depth of field. There's only one example I have here for the Blur tool. Click Open. Yes, I know it's all right. It's a PSD because it was such a small capture that if I saved it as a JPEG, it reduced the file size even more. By saving it as a Photoshop document, we didn't lose any more resolution. And this is my idea of one of the few ways you might use the Blur tool. This person who took this said, you know, that hand is too sharp. I like the glasses and the face, but the hand should have, I should have set my aperture with less depth of field and blurred out the hand, but I didn't. So we're going to use the Blur tool and get rid of some of the sharpness on his knuckles. So we know it's destructive, but you'll notice if you grab the Blur tool, you have sample all layers available. That tells you you don't have to double the background and double the size of the file. You simply add a new layer, create a new layer. In the Choices with the Layers panel is the torn piece of paper image. When you click it, you get a transparent layer above the layer that was active. So we're going to be working on a transparent layer. So if we mess up, we can just dump that transparent layer. You have not yet touched the pixel images. Okay? So go up to the layers, the torn piece of paper. Yeah, okay. Now you've got the Blur tool, hopefully all of you. And you have several things you can control. You can choose to not only blur, but darken, lighten, change the hue, the saturation, the color, or the luminosity means you're not going to affect the color in the image. just the brightness that causes that to look sharp. And quite often, by choosing a luminosity mode, you don't change the color. I had somebody this week who was having a problem because when they adjusted an image, the color changed on the image. It was like they applied a white balance shift and they didn't want to. And one of the answers is you can, if you're not deliberately working with color, in other words, if you're trying to work with the color, obviously you have to have color. But if you were making a levels adjustment or a brightness and contrast adjustment and you don't want to affect the color of the image, you may change the brush mode to luminosity. Let's try it. It's a way of protecting the color. Now I realize there's not much color to protect, but it's a neat little option that I have found brightness and contrast adjustment layers will sometimes change the actual tonality of the color. And I don't want that. If that layer that I worked on is changed to a mode of luminosity, it gets rid of the color change. Similarly, if a brush is a luminosity brush, it's not going to affect the tonality or the color. So we have it luminosity. The brush is soft here. The size we're going to set from the keyboard. And the strength depends how much do you want to blur it. And sometimes it's trial and error. So if we leave it at 100% and it's overdone, we undo our action, right? And do it again at lower. But I found that this tool doesn't seem to be tremendously powerful. So I'm putting it at 100%. So bring your mouse over it and decide how big the brush should be. That's a little bit big. Okay? And I want to blur his hand. So I'm working on the copy layer. I can go over his hand and lift it up. And to see what I did, you can turn on and off that extra layer. Can you see how it helped to blur out that foreground item? This tool, I think, is best when you have a little tiny area that's the problem. There's no reason to go through and do a whole selection just to isolate his hand.
Am I supposed to be pressing down on something or anything?
Yes, whenever you use a tool, you hold your mouse button down. Every time you copy the background, you've made your file size twice as big. And you have to say, did I need to? In this case, the tool offers you sample all layers. If it offers that option, then you can create a new layer and not duplicate the background.
And if you flatten it, does it go back to normal size?
If you flatten an image and you had 2 copies of the background, you go back to 1 copy, right? But I find it's worthwhile thinking yourself through, do I need to copy the background? If you need to paint right on the pixels and you don't have any sample all layers option, you got to copy it. But if the tool comes with sample all layers, it's telling you just creating a new layer will work, providing you check sample all layers. Okay, let's go to File, Open. Okay. The other one that is limited use is the Sharpen Tool. We've just learned all these wonderful ways to sharpen. The only reason I would do that is if there was a tiny little area that I wanted to sharpen in a picture, period. So if you open my flower, Smudge, Sharpen, Sponge Tool, it means it will work with lots of different things. Open that one up. Now, one of the tutorials that I saw had a lousy example, so I didn't do a screenshot, but it was a good idea. It said if you have a portrait and it's a little tiny bit soft, sometimes that's attractive in a portrait if it's a little bit soft, and you want to sharpen the eyes, the Sharpen tool would let you go in and just sharpen the eyes. That would be a good use for it. Unfortunately, the image they gave you was so blurred, it was hard to believe it would do much good to sharpen the eyes. But sometimes an image is quite acceptable you don't want every pore showing. So sometimes a portrait ends up very nice and beautiful, but the eyes somehow have lost it. This is a way to sharpen part of an image. So what am I going to do with this? I'm going to sharpen, these are stamen, aren't they, in the middle of the flower? So will you zoom in on the middle of the flower? Grab your zoom tool from the toolbox. Come in and zoom in the middle. I gave you a couple clicks and you're at 100%. But at least you can see the middle. Now, I'm not trying to say this is necessarily all practical, but this shows you how you can use the Sharpen tool. So go to the same group of tools, choose the Sharpen tool, and notice it has a sample all layers option. That tells me I can work on a new layer, a transparent layer. So go to that torn piece of paper and add a transparent layer. And then go over to the Sharpen tool. The brush is soft, so the effect is not going to spread over. It's going to be mostly right under your brush. That's what a blur tool says, that the middle gets the effect and it fades out as you go away from the center. So it's a normal mode. Again, it could be luminosity. So let's try it normal and see what the difference is. Strength, again, let's leave it at 100%, but you can always have less strength if it's too much. Sample all layers. I can't tell you what protect detail means. Just, it's a default, I would leave it. I'm sure I could go and search for what that means. So here I am. I'm working on a layer that's above the background, and I've sampled all layers. I'm going to work on the, what do you call the end of this? Is that the stamen, the very end?
Aren't there pistils in there?
Pistils are somewhere, but anywhere. I'm going to enlarge it a little bit, just enough to be sure I'm covering it. And I'm going to go over that. Oh, it's way too much. Can you see the effect?
Yeah.
So what do? I undo. You can either go Edit, Undo Sharpen Tool, or you know the keyboard one, Control or Command Z. Why Z is undo? I have no idea. So it said to me, 100% is too much. Let's come down to 50%. And let's do it again. Oh, that's
much.
much.
Play with opacity.
Yes, I could. If I'm done with the layer, I could do. But if I change the opacity and I do anything else on that layer, the opacity affects everything I do. So sometimes I want to get each brush stroke correct, because I may do something else. I'm going to do another thing in this. Okay, so I've brought those out a bit. You know, you can argue whether it's worth doing, but you see how it works. I also think a little sharpening on the bud might be attractive, but I don't think I want 56%. I'm going to go down to 25 or 30%, and I'm going to sharpen the bud just a little bit. And of course, how do I see the effect of this? I hide that layer. My eyes can't see two things at once. So I hide the layer and look at the stamen. Oh, I see how I brought that out. That's kind of nice. Now I hide it and I look at the bud. Even that helped the bud a little, didn't it? Now, why would I use the Sharpen tool? Because I only wanted to work on little tiny detail. If I want to work on a lot of an area, there's a lot better ways to sharpen. But this is kind of a neat option if you're trying to sharpen something. For instance, if you have a portrait and you want the eyes and the lips maybe, or the, I don't know, teeth, who wants their teeth sharpened? No. But at least the eyes are really critical, aren't they? Yes. Most of us don't have teeth worthy of being sharpened. Okay, so I didn't have a good example, but I encourage you to look for a portrait you've done and see whether this would be helpful to just slightly sharpen the eyes of a picture. And if so, that's a good use of this tool. And again, these tools, I believe, are for minor adjustments, not for global ones. Okay, so while we're here, let us go and zoom back out to the whole image. If you go to the View menu, you have the option Fit on Screen. which is also Command or Control 0. And we'll see the whole image in one click. We're back at the whole image. All right, I said that we could do several things with this. So while we're here, we're going to look at the Smudge Tool, which is the third one of this group. Now, Sharon mentioned this tool because she went to Massachusetts and saw a workshop where somebody did little tiny things with the Smudge Tool. And I insist little tiny things are probably what you want to do. But I gave you a PDF file with links. That means you click on a link and you go out to a tutorial. And there is a tutorial on the Smudge Tool. We're going to duplicate it on this image so you understand the Smudge Tool. Not because I necessarily think I would use it on this image. The Smudge Tool is blurred with action. That means you blur and you get movement. Think about pictures that you took of a skater, one of those roller derby skaters, and the background is blurred. But you want to move some action around her. You want it to look like she's going faster. You might use this tool. So let's go down to the group and choose the Smudge Tool this time. And you're going to see, this is one reason for not playing with the opacity. For this example, we're going to work on the same extra layer for everything. But if I wanted to control the Smudge Tool separately from the Sharpen Tool, I would take another new layer, understand? If I don't want them all to be affected on one layer, I just create a multiple set of new layers. But in this case, we don't worry about it. Sample all layers. Don't sample finger painting. You can do that later. Strength, 50% about. And watch what I'm going to do. I'm going to blur the background, but I'm going to make it swoosh out, away from the flower. So I start next to the flower, I press the mouse, and I drag it out. Ooh, smoosh. Play around with it. It is kind of fun, especially if you're creating special effects. Now, they say if you get too close to the flower and you're in a tiny area, just make your brush smaller. Oh, isn't that cool? Folks, if you do this, please enter your picture in creative. If you did this by changing your... Oh, I've got things to announce. Thank you, Sharon, for reminding me earlier. This is a good time to announce it. Science Museum Camera Club is offering summer classes. Summer school, we're calling it. And we can't use the museum because the museum is not open in the evening over the summer. So we're holding them here. And the first ones are being taught by Charles Bartolotta, and they're basic camera controls with respect to aperture and shutter and ISO. These are, pardon? Yeah, depth of field, which is controlled by those. Look at that, is that wild? I don't know if I like it. But it's just fun to know. So what does the Smudge Tool do? It blurs with a direction. So if you don't want much direction, you click it and barely move it. In other words, if you were to click it and only move it a little bit, you wouldn't get much of that streak. Starting June 7th, which is next Wednesday. Are you all listening?
Yes.
Charlie starts a series of classes on camera controls where he will emphasize how you get proper depth of field. A lot of us can take really nice pictures without understanding how aperture and shutter really work. This is your chance to really understand it. The 7th, I happen to have a driver safety class scheduled in this room. So for that night, they're going to go up the stairs to Fellowship Hall up above. And we will have a nice sign which says, camera class up the stairs and driver safety class in here. And you'll bring your camera and any manual you have, and there'll be extra people helping him, so if somebody needs individual help. And the idea is to get the technical understanding of how to use those features of your camera. Then, a week later, there's a field trip to announce the details. Then, this is the third magic. That next Wednesday, which would be the 21st, they're coming into this room and they're going to look at their pictures, evaluate, and took a little bit of post-processing on those same images. So the month of June is on camera controls with respect to depth of field. We're repeating 3 weeks in July, and it'll all be on macro photography. And then 3 weeks in August on architectural photography. Anybody can come to it. All they're asking is that you make a donation toward the church's use of the room. Otherwise, anybody's welcome to come. But you should call Sharon so she can let Charlie know how many.
Or email me, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, either tell her or email her. But if you know somebody who's at that level where they use their camera and they do pretty well, but they've avoided manual mode because they have no idea how to control aperture or shutter or ISO. Together, those three control lots of things in your camera. They control the exposure, they control the depth of field, and Charlie is emphasizing depth of field. Okay, so we've done a smudge tool, and you can see what it does. I've given you all kinds of tutorials. To know more about it, just follow through on some of them. Now, let us go down, and do you know how to go back to the beginning? Well, in this case, I gave this to you with an extra layer, didn't I? Okay, let's delete that top layer. Okay, layer, whatever layer you've got, delete it. Okay, we're back to the original. We're going to look over at the sponge tool, and it's in a different group. So in your toolbox, you have a thing which looks like a sponge, and it's with the dodge and burn tools. Now, my little statement about this is, I would never recommend that you dodge and burn with these tools. The far better way is the way we've learned, where you add a dodge and burn layer, which is 50% gray, and you apply brightening and darkening to the pixels there. And most of all, we have learned how to add Tony Kuiper's luminosity masks to a dodge and burn layer, which really controls where you dodge and burn. If you dodge and burn on an image, even with an extra layer, you've got to be meticulously careful, or your dodging and burning will overlap parts you don't want. So I'm not bothering to even mention it other than to say we have better ways to dodge and burn. And maybe that's a topic I might cover another Saturday, showing you the methods of dodging and burning that are much better controlled. But we have sponge as one of those. So grab the sponge tool. And sponge tool, again, is only useful when you want a very limited area affected and you want to do it in a hurry. It's nowhere near as good quality as adding a hue and saturation layer. So we're going to do it two ways. We're going to try the dodge and burn tool on this flower. I would like to cut back on the yellow in the middle of that flower. I just think it's overdone. So there are two modes for the sponge tool. Guess what? Desaturate or saturate. So I want to desaturate that part of the image. So I choose desaturate. And the flow means something like strength, how the rate of saturation change. In other words, if you want to change it suddenly, you'd put it at 100%. It's sort of like we always say opacity. They just use a different word. I'm going to leave it 50%. And of course, the size we do from the keyboard. So my brush has got to be a little... Oh, yes, thank you. This one, aha, you cannot. There is no work on all layers, sample all layers. So what do you have to do? Make a copy of the background, which we've been doing today. Command or Control J, or layer, duplicate layer. And I'm going to call it sponge, yes. I'm even going to write sponge tool. all that is nonsense. If it doesn't bother you, don't bother naming it. Okay, so I have my sponge tool. I'm going to desaturate, and I hate to say this, but you've got every brush ever created available to you. So you can try all kinds of crazy brushes. I'm just going to use the default brushes, hard or soft. But many of these tools that use the brush tool have all these choices. Really kind of crazy. So close that down. And I'm desaturating with the soft brush at 50%. And I'm going to zoom in a little to help me see the place I'm working on. It's always better to see it enlarged. So I go back. After you've enlarged it, you've got to go back and re-click the sponge tool. Come in here and take your finger. Once your finger is down, don't lift it till you're done, and then lift it. Because when you lift it, you'll apply more desaturating every time you rebrush. As long as the finger stays down, it's one application of desaturate. If you lift your mouse button and you go back again, you desaturate more, which is awful. How do I undo my last thing? Command or Control Z. Okay, if all you want to do is desaturate an area, hear the word area, a small area, this might do the job for you. If you've got some weird artifact in your image that is sticking out and it's too saturated, this is a way to deal with a little tiny artifact. But what is the better way? I'm going to ask you to get rid of the sponge layer. So it's layer, delete, layer. It's under the layer. Okay. You can right-click on a lot of these things and get the same commands. I find for new people, they like to see the directions rather than all this black magic. Okay. So if we want to change the saturation of this flower, we would normally add a Hue and Saturation Adjustment layer. Go to the top or bottom of the layer panel and find the bicolor circle. Click on it. Choose Hue Saturation. This gives you a whole new layer upon which to work and great control. Instead of controlling by area, we're going to control by color. And so if I want to reduce this wicked color in here, if I say I don't want to work on the entire image, I want to choose a specific color, I first choose a channel. So pop open the master window. And it doesn't matter what channel you're going to turn into that color. I tend to choose the channel that is closest to it, but it doesn't matter. Yellow. And how do I determine what yellow it's going to be? Well, they choose neutral yellow. That is not the color up there. So you go to the first eyedropper, which is the color picker tool. And you go over and click on the color you want to desaturate. And look what happens up on the screen. Boom, pop. It said, Jill, that isn't pure yellow. That's a mixture of yellow and red. Now, when I desaturate, I'm zeroing in on that exact color, and I can lower the saturation any amount I want to, or I could raise the saturation. Ah! And what it's doing is it's looking throughout the entire image for this color only. And it will pick that color anywhere it exists. We in class here have done a fall scene this way. We looked at a fall scene and we said the red leaves are lacking punch because the clouds were half under, the sun was behind the clouds. So we opened that image. We chose the red color that was in one leaf, and it found all of the leaves in the picture that were that color. And when we raised the saturation, all of that color, wherever it occurred, increased saturation. That's powerful compared to a little area. But there might be a little area, and I think an artifact that got into your picture that you don't want. Sometimes desaturating it might be all you have to do instead of cloning it out. Okay? So this is a much more powerful tool, and it gives you a mask. So let's say it found this color somewhere else, Command or Control 0, and it reduced it. There's nothing in here. But let's say it reduced it here, but it also found it over here, and I don't like it. I've got a mask, don't I? So I can hide the effect from anywhere in that image. Once again, layers and masks. So we've overworked poor Flower. Close them, and we're past 10:30. We didn't get kicked out by early arrivals. So we've basically looked at most of the ideas. We didn't work them as thoroughly as you can. If you go back over to the material that I gave you here, since they haven't kicked us out, let's go in and just open. I didn't do Vivesa more. Next week, we go back to Vivesa because there's more to it than we said. I've had a request to do a little more depth on some Nick software, in spite of all the rumors. So anyway, you've got it. You're not going to lose it. You've got Nick. Even if they decide to do something and not keep providing it, you've got it. Here's, what's this? Oh, I found a digital photography school. I've provided this to Charlie. Some of you might like to see that link. I gave it to you here. And I gave you Tim Gray handout. Specialty links. Here are all kinds of links, folks. Have fun.